So although the imperative to be sustainable is nothing new, what research is increasingly showing is that, somewhat paradoxically, the more that we become aware about the need to become more sustainable, the less we're seeing actually any improvements on the sustainability front. And contrary to the kind of popular line, the book is really arguing that it's actually not very easy to be green. And there are lots of complex reasons why that's the case. So the book is really trying to answer that question. You know, what are those challenges and dilemmas of being sustainable in the home? Sometimes they're technical issues, and sometimes they're actually around our everyday life, our cultural norms and practices, and the way we do things is sometimes difficult to budge.
So do you think there is a lot of misinformation that needs correcting? Is that a part of it, or are there other things at play as well?
So I think it's true that there's misinformation around particular issues, and some of that's technical and difficult for the ordinary person to know about. So I mean, a great example is plastic bags, for instance. We know that we shouldn't be chucking out plastic bags or necessarily relying or depending on plastic bags, but we don't necessarily know that the so-called green bag that we take to our supermarket also has a high resource intensity and energy intensity in its production. So you need to be using a green bag like that about 100 times before it becomes actually a better option than regular disposable plastic bags. The type of plastic bag matters, because there's different types of plastics involved. So better off actually trying to avoid using a bag altogether might be actually more the message. So yeah, some of it's actually quite complex. You sort of need to know the chemistry of plastic before you can begin to assess what kind of plastic bag you should or shouldn't be using. So yeah, that's true. I mean, I think there is a lot of misinformation. And another really good example we go into in the book is around food, and the presumption that local food is automatically more sustainable than food that's been imported from some other place. There are lots of reasons why it might be really good to consume local food, employing local farmers, having a connection to the land, knowing that your food comes from the region in which you live, but it's not necessarily intrinsically more sustainable in terms of carbon emissions or energy use, water use and those sorts of things. It actually matters where your food's come from, how precisely it's been produced, before it actually ends up in your shopping basket and on your plate for dinner. So the same 2 tomatoes on a shelf could come from entirely different places with different greenhouse production methods. In Sydney, you've got tomatoes grown in greenhouses where they use coal to fire the heating for the greenhouses. Others don't. That simple fact can change the carbon footprint of an ordinary tomato quite substantially, so to speak. Nonetheless, every single one of those chapters was really interesting. The flying chapter was particularly interesting because in universities people fly a lot. And in fact, some of the material that I came across which was really interesting was about one article entitled, for example, something like Environmentalist in Business Class. It was about the contradictions of people who work in organisations, including universities, but also big companies who the individuals may be committed to reducing their footprint or interested or concerned about environmental issues. Institutions may espouse concerns for reducing their footprint, for being more sustainable, but nonetheless they have corporate cultures or university cultures that really reward the activities that are undertaken by plane travel, which is a very energy intensive way to travel. And it becomes more intensive as well, and this is a message for our leaders, it becomes more intensive if you fly business class, of course. Your footprint, your energy consumption per flight increases dramatically if you're not travelling cattle class. So that was very interesting. So again, it comes back to the message of the book, which is about the fact that it's not just about individual actions, it's not just about household decisions and that decision-making unit, but about those broader contexts, including our working environments, our workplace cultures that we're part of. So
the chapter on death, I mean, it's not something that a lot of people like to talk about. How did you come up with data on dying?
Yes, that was a bit tricky. One thing I did discover is that there is more than one academic journal devoted to death, which was a bit of a revelation. Not surprising, I suppose. In academia, there's something for everyone. We know that. So in one sense, that's not too surprising. I just never had reason to look at those journals.
So they were interesting, but for that chapter in particular, I found that I really had to scour the so-called grey literature and industry sites as well, particularly for those technologies that associated with disposing of bodies, which is what a lot of it comes down to. Those technologies that were new. So it's a matter of literally, in some cases, getting in touch with the companies that are selling those ways of cremating someone or otherwise rendering their body into something more manageable than 80 kilos of organic matter, which is what it, which is... That was actually interesting. One of the ways that I began to think about it was death and dying as a problem of disposing of large amounts of organic matter. And I found a figure for the UK which was, I think, per annum from a few years ago, dying presented the issue of disposing of around 37,000 tonnes of organic matter every year, which sounds like quite a lot. I'm not sure how that compares to disposing of waste more generally. Maybe it's a blip, but nonetheless, it's 40,000 tonnes of bodies. It's quite a bit.
So the statistics show that something like between 5 and 10% of all of our carbon impact in Western societies comes from Christmas. So it's an orgy of consumption in many ways. In an ideal world, we could say, look, just don't do that. Don't overconsume at Christmas. But the reality is that Christmas means a lot to us socially and culturally. It's a time for celebration. It's a time for abundance and for sharing and being generous with your family. Those are kind of really important cultural values that we subscribe to. So, they're not going to be shifted easily, and maybe we shouldn't try and shift those. But what we can do are things like recycling all of the wrapping paper. I put it in my compost, actually. Some gifts you can make yourself or repurpose, buy second-hand stuff. Sort of be measured, I suppose, around gift giving, and just think about the gifts that you're giving and where they've come from, how they've been produced. Is there more value in something that's been carefully selected because you spent time hunting for it in a second-hand shop rather than just heading on down to the local mega store to buy some cheap and nasty piece of stuff to give to someone. So being considerate and thoughtful is part of it.
Possibly the standout issue for me is the one that the effective life of a mobile phone is it can be about 10 years, possibly even longer. That's what manufacturers say a phone should last for. And to break even on an ecological footprint analysis, you need to keep your phone between 7 to 12 years, depending on the assumptions that are made. But of course, phones are turned over on average every 2 to 3 years. And that's partly the phone owners making the decisions, and of course we all know it's also the networks make it very easy for us to do that. So I think that was one of the key messages, is that in terms of the resources that go into manufacturing phones, we're a long way off where we could be in terms of minimising or at least reducing significantly the ecological footprint of phone ownership.
And how significant is our capacity to recycle and break down and recycle the various bits and pieces in phones?
My understanding, from what I learned, is that it's quite significant. It can be done. Many components of the phones can be recycled, and there are systems set up to do that. But that gets us to the other key thing that came out, is that there's a phenomenon known as mobile phone hoarding. And there are estimates of the number of phone sets in drawers in Australia. I can't remember the figure exactly, but it's millions of phones sitting in drawers that people are not taking up the free recycling schemes to the extent they might be. The Mobile Muster and other ones like that.